rich woman humiliates her new employee for being late. But one day she decides to follow her home to discover the truth. What she sees through the half-open door leaves her in tears. Victoria Montero paced through the living room of her luxurious mansion, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Her gaze scrutinized every corner, searching for the slightest trace of dust or imperfection. With a gesture of disgust, she ran her finger over the surface of an antique table. "Unacceptable," she exclaimed, turning to her housekeeper. "Maria, where is the new employee? She should have arrived half an hour ago." Maria, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, responded with a trembling voice. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Montero. Elena hasn't arrived yet. I assure you it's the first time." "The first time," Victoria interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Don't take me for a fool, Maria. It's the third time this week. If it weren't because you recommended her." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Maria hurried to open it, relieved by the interruption. Elena, a young woman with a humble appearance and a nervous look, entered hastily. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Montero," Elena began, out of breath. "The bus was delayed and—" Victoria raised a hand, silencing her. "Spare me the excuses, Elena. Your work starts at 8 o'clock sharp. It's 8:37. Can't you read a clock?" Elena lowered her gaze, embarrassed. "Yes, ma'am. It won't happen again." "I hope so," Victoria responded coldly. "Now, get to work. I have guests tonight and I want the house spotless." "Understood." Elena nodded quickly and headed to the kitchen to start her tasks. Maria followed her, casting an apologetic look at Victoria before disappearing down the hallway. Throughout the day, Elena worked tirelessly, cleaning every corner of the mansion under Victoria's critical gaze. Every time the lady of the house passed by, Elena felt her heart racing, fearing another reprimand. "Elena," Victoria called from the dining room, "come here immediately." With trembling hands, Elena presented herself before her boss. "Yes, Mrs. Montero." Victoria pointed to an almost imperceptible stain on one of the crystal glasses. "You call this clean? Wash them all again. And this time, do it properly." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm very sorry," Elena responded, taking the tray with the glasses. As she walked away, she heard Victoria mutter, "If it weren't so difficult to find competent staff." The hours passed, and the tension in the house grew as the time for dinner approached. Victoria fluttered from one side to the other, supervising every detail. "Maria," she shouted, "where is the floral arrangement for the main table?" Maria appeared, carrying a huge vase full of exotic flowers. "Here it is, ma'am." "I'm sorry, the florist was late with the delivery." Victoria frowned. "It seems incompetence is contagious. Place it in the center and make sure it's perfectly aligned." While Maria struggled with the heavy vase, Elena entered the dining room with a stack of plates. "Careful," Victoria exclaimed upon seeing Elena stumble slightly. "Those plates are worth more than your yearly salary." Elena blushed, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll be more careful." "I hope so," Victoria responded with disdain. "Now, go change. I don't want my guests to see you in those work clothes." Elena nodded and headed to the staff quarters to put on her gala uniform. As she changed, she couldn't help but let a tear roll down her cheek. "Are you all right, dear?" Maria asked, entering the room. Elena quickly wiped away the tear. "Yes, it's just that. I don't know if I can endure this much longer." Maria gave her a quick hug. "I know, sweetie. Mrs. Montero can be very harsh, but you need this job, right?" Elena nodded, thinking about her situation at home, more than she can imagine. "Then be strong," Maria advised her. "And remember, no matter what happens tonight, don't let it affect you." The guests began to arrive shortly after 8. Elena and the rest of the staff moved silently among the groups, serving appetizers and drinks. Victoria, transformed into a charming hostess, laughed and chatted with her guests. "Victoria, darling," said a woman in an ostentatious dress, "your house is always impeccable. What's your secret?" Victoria smiled with false modesty. "Oh, Beatrice, it's just a matter of having dedicated staff and staying on top of them." Speaking of which, Victoria gestured for Elena to come closer. "Elena, dear, bring another bottle of the 98 Chardonnay." Elena nodded and headed to the cellar. While searching for the right bottle, she heard Victoria's voice resonating through the intercom that connected the cellar to the living room. And to think she was late again today. It's so hard to find good staff these days. The laughter of the guests made Elena blush with shame. With trembling hands, she took the bottle and went up the stairs. Upon entering the living room, Elena headed directly towards Victoria to serve her. In her nervousness, she didn't see the small step that separated the bar area from the rest of the room. She stumbled, and the bottle escaped from her hands. The sound of glass breaking against the floor made the entire room fall silent. The wine splashed Victoria's dress and the shoes of some nearby guests. "Oh my God!" exclaimed Beatrice, jumping back. Victoria, her face red with anger and embarrassment, looked at Elena as if she wanted to make her disappear at that instant. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Montero," Elena stammered, bending down to pick up the pieces of glass. "Leave it," Victoria shouted. "Can't you do anything right? First you arrive late, then you don't clean properly, and now this. Do you have any idea how much that bottle cost?" Elena, with tears in her eyes, didn't know what to say. The guests observed the scene, some with pity, others with a mixture of disgust and amusement. I'll pay for it," Elena said softly. Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "Pay for it? With what money? That wine costs more than you earn in a month." "Victoria, dear," an older man intervened, trying to calm the situation. "Accidents happen. Why don't we move to the dining room?" But Victoria was too furious to listen. "No, Ricardo, my guests deserve to know what kind of incompetence I have to deal with daily." She turned to Elena. "Tell them, Elena. Tell them how many times you've been late this week." Elena, trembling, could barely whisper. "3 times, ma'am." "And why do you think you're still working here?" Victoria continued, relentless. "Only because Maria interceded for you. But my patience has a limit. One more, Elena. One more mistake and you're fired." "Understood," Elena nodded, tears freely running down her cheeks. "Yes, Mrs. Montero." "Now clean up this mess and go home," Victoria ordered. "I don't want to see you for the rest of the night." As Elena hurried to clean up the spilled wine and pieces of glass, she heard Victoria addressing her guests. "I apologize for this regrettable spectacle. Please let's move to the dining room. I promise the rest of the evening will be much more pleasant." Maria appeared next to Elena, helping her clean up. "Go home, dear," she whispered. "I'll take care of this." Elena, still sobbing, nodded gratefully. She took off her uniform in record time and left through the service door, wishing she could disappear. Meanwhile, in the dining room, dinner continued. Victoria, regaining her composure, acted as if nothing had happened. However, not all her guests were willing to forget so easily. "Victoria," Beatrice said as they tasted the main course. "Don't you think you were a bit harsh with the girl?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Harsh? Beatrice, dear, if you don't keep the staff in line, they take advantage of you. Besides, what would you know? Your servants are all robots." There were some uncomfortable laughs around the table. Ricardo, the older man who had tried to intervene earlier, spoke. "Still, Victoria, we all make mistakes." The girl seemed truly sorry. "Oh, please," Victoria responded, taking a sip of wine. "Don't tell me you're all suddenly defenders of workers' rights. If you want to lecture someone on how to treat staff, talk to your own employees." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but the incident with Elena had left a bitter taste in the evening. Some guests left earlier than usual, citing previous commitments. When the last guest left, Victoria collapsed into an armchair in the living room. Maria approached timidly. "Mrs. Montero, do you need anything else?" Victoria looked at her tiredly. "Yes, Maria. I need you to explain to me why you insist on defending that incompetent girl." Maria took a deep breath before responding. "Ma'am, Elena is a good worker. She just needs a little patience. She has difficult circumstances at home." "Circumstances?" Victoria scoffed. "We all have circumstances, Maria. That's no excuse for incompetence." "I know, ma'am," Maria responded. "But if you gave her a chance..." Victoria raised a hand, silencing her. "Enough. I've had enough drama for tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about Elena's future in this house. Now retire." Maria nodded and left, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, Elena arrived at her modest apartment in a peripheral neighborhood of the city. Upon opening the door, she was greeted by the sound of a weak cough coming from the back room. "Mom," Elena called, hurrying to the room. "How are you?" An older woman, pale and emaciated, lay in bed. "I'm fine, sweetie. How was your day?" Elena forced a smile, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Good, Mom. Everything's fine. Did you take your medicines?" Her mother nodded weakly. "Yes, but, Elena, they're running out. And the doctor said I'll need more tests next week." Elena felt her heart shrink. She thought about the incident that night, about Victoria's threat of dismissal. How was she going to pay for the medicines and tests if she lost her job? Don't worry, Mom, she said, trying to sound confident. I'll take care of everything. You just focus on resting and getting better, okay? Her mother weakly squeezed her hand. You're a good daughter, Elena. I don't know what I'd do without you. Elena waited until her mother fell asleep before allowing herself to cry silently. Victoria's cruel words resonated in her mind, mixing with concern for her mother's health and uncertainty about her future. That night, while Victoria slept in her luxurious king-size bed, surrounded by feather pillows, Elena spent the night awake, sitting by her mother's bed, wondering how she was going to face the next day, and fearing that each cough could be the last. Victoria Montero was in her study, reviewing some documents when her gaze drifted to the clock. It was 5:30 in the afternoon. Maria, she called through the intercom. Has Elena left yet? Maria's voice responded with a tone of surprise. Not yet, ma'am. She's finishing cleaning the terrace. Victoria frowned. Tell her to come to my study immediately. Minutes later, Elena timidly knocked on the study door. Come in, Victoria said firmly. Elena entered, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and nervousness. You called me, Mrs. Montero? Victoria looked at her intently. Elena, your shift ended half an hour ago. Why are you still here? Elena blinked, surprised by the question. I was finishing cleaning the terrace, ma'am. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. Perfect. Victoria arched an eyebrow. Do you expect me to pay you overtime? No, ma'am, Elena quickly replied. I just wanted to do my job well. Victoria stood up from her chair and walked around Elena, studying her. You're late in the mornings, but you stay late. What are you up to, Elena? Elena felt her heart racing. I'm not up to anything, ma'am. I'm just trying to be a good employee. A good employee arrives on time, Victoria retorted. Gather your things and leave. And tomorrow, make sure you arrive on time. Elena nodded and headed towards the door, but before leaving, she stopped and turned. Mrs. Montero, about my salary, Victoria interrupted her. We've already talked about that, Elena. The cost of the wine will come out of your pay. I know, Elena said with a trembling voice. But my mother, she needs medicines and... It's not my problem, Victoria cut her off. If you can't manage your finances, maybe you should look for an additional job. Elena left the study, holding back tears. As she gathered her things, Maria approached her. Are you all right, dear? Maria asked with concern. Elena shook her head. I don't know what I'm going to do, Maria. I need that money. Maria looked around to make sure no one was listening. Listen, Elena. I know a place where they're looking for staff for night shifts. It's not much, but it could help you. Elena's eyes lit up. Really? Oh, Maria, that would be wonderful. I'll give you the address, Maria said, quickly writing on a piece of paper. But be careful, okay? I don't want you to exhaust yourself. Elena hugged Maria. Thank you, you're an angel. As Elena left through the service door, Victoria watched her from the window of her study. Something about the young woman's behavior both intrigued and bothered her. What are you hiding, Elena? She muttered to herself. The following days passed with a tense calm. Elena arrived punctually every morning, with increasingly pronounced dark circles under her eyes, but determined not to give any reason for complaint. Victoria, for her part, observed her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. One afternoon, while Elena was cleaning the living room, Victoria unexpectedly entered. Elena, she said, startling the young woman, I need you to stay late today. I have an important dinner and I want everything to be perfect. Elena turned pale. Mrs. Montero, I have a commitment tonight. Couldn't Maria stay? Victoria narrowed her eyes. A commitment? What could be more important than your job? It's personal, Elena replied, avoiding Victoria's gaze. Personal? Victoria let out a dry laugh. Elena, let me be clear. Either you stay tonight or you can look for another job. Understood. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Understood, Mrs. Montero. I'll stay. Victoria nodded, satisfied, and left the room. Elena immediately took out her phone and dialed a number. Hello? Yes, it's me. I'm very sorry, but I won't be able to come tonight. Could you cover for me? Thanks, I owe you one. The dinner went without incident. Elena worked diligently, serving the guests and making sure everything was perfect. Victoria, for her part, kept observing her, noticing her efficiency, but also her evident fatigue. When the last guest left, Victoria approached Elena. Good work tonight, she said, surprising Elena with the unexpected compliment. Thank you, Mrs. Montero, Elena responded, confused. Victoria looked at her intently. Now will you tell me what that important commitment was? Elena hesitated for a moment. I have a second job. At nights, Victoria raised an eyebrow. A second job? Why? I need the extra money, Elena replied softly. For my mother's medicines. Victoria was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she said, I see. Well, you can go, but tomorrow I want you here early and rested. I won't tolerate mistakes due to your lack of sleep. Elena nodded and hurried to leave. Victoria watched her go, a strange feeling of unease taking over her. The next day, Victoria woke up earlier than usual. Something had been bothering her all night, and she had made a decision. Maria, she called, as she went down the stairs. Has Elena arrived yet? Maria appeared with a cup of coffee. Yes, ma'am, she's in the kitchen. Victoria nodded. Good. Tell her I'll see her in my study in 5 minutes. When Elena entered the study, Victoria immediately noticed the dark circles under her eyes. Sit down, Victoria ordered, pointing to a chair in front of her desk. Elena obeyed, nervous. Did I do something wrong, Mrs. Montero? Victoria looked at her intently. Elena, I'm going to be direct. I don't like my employees having other jobs. It affects their performance here. Elena felt her blood run cold. Mrs. Montero, I'm not finished, Victoria interrupted. However, I understand that you have special circumstances, so I propose a deal. Elena looked at her confused. A deal? Victoria nodded. You'll quit that night job. In exchange, I'll increase your salary enough to cover what you earn there. But she added, raising a finger, I expect absolute dedication and punctuality. Understood. Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. Yes, Mrs. Montero. Thank you very much. Victoria made a gesture with her hand, dismissing it. Don't thank me, it's a business agreement. Now, get back to work. When Elena left the study, Victoria remained thoughtful. Why had she done that? Had Beatrice's words affected her more than she wanted to admit? The following days passed with a strange calm. Elena arrived punctually every morning, working with renewed energy. Victoria, for her part, observed her with a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity. One afternoon, while Elena was cleaning the library, Victoria unexpectedly entered. Elena, she said, startling the young woman. How is your mother? Elena blinked, surprised by the question. She's better, Mrs. Montero. Thank you for asking. Victoria nodded, uncomfortable. Good, I'm glad. Continue with your work. As Victoria left the library, Elena couldn't help but smile. Was her boss starting to soften? However, the calm wouldn't last long. A week later, Victoria noticed something strange in Elena's behavior. The young woman seemed nervous, constantly looking at the clock. Elena, Victoria called from her study. Come here for a moment. Elena entered, visibly anxious. Yes, Mrs. Montero. Victoria looked at her intently. Is there a problem? You seem distracted. Elena hesitated for a moment. No, ma'am. Everything's fine. Victoria narrowed her eyes. Don't lie to me, Elena. You know I hate that. Elena took a deep breath. It's my mother, ma'am. She had a relapse. She needs to go to the hospital, but You what? Victoria pressed. I can't take her, Elena said softly. My shift doesn't end for another 2 hours. Victoria was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, Go. Elena looked at her, surprised. What? Go to your mother, Victoria repeated. But tomorrow I want you to arrive early to make up for the time. Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. Thank you, Mrs. Montero. Thank you very much. As Elena hurriedly left, Victoria remained thoughtful. Why did she feel so uneasy? Was she starting to worry about Elena? That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. The image of Elena rushing to attend to her sick mother haunted her. Without thinking too much, she got up and got dressed. This is crazy, she muttered to herself as she left the mansion. Victoria drove to the hospital, wondering what the hell she was doing. When she arrived, she stayed in the car, watching the entrance. After an hour of waiting, she saw Elena come out, looking tired but relieved. Without thinking, Victoria followed her in her car. Elena walked a few blocks until she reached a run-down apartment building. Victoria parked nearby and watched her enter. What am I doing? Victoria asked herself, but something compelled her to continue. She approached the building and climbed the stairs, following the sound of footsteps. On the 3rd floor, she saw Elena enter an apartment. Victoria approached the door, which had been left ajar. Through the crack, she could see the interior of the small apartment. What she saw left her breathless. Elena was kneeling next to a bed where an older woman, obviously ill, lay. The apartment was small and poorly furnished, but clean. "Mom," she heard Elena say, "I'm home. How are you feeling?" The woman in the bed smiled weakly. "Better now that you're here, my child. How was work?" Elena stroked her mother's hair. "Good, Mom. Mrs. Montero let me leave early to come to you." Elena's mother seemed surprised. "Really? I thought you said she was very strict." Elena smiled. "She is, but I think she's changing. Today she was very understanding." Victoria felt a pang in her chest upon hearing those words. Had she really been that terrible? "I'm glad, sweetie," Elena's mother said, "but I don't want you to get into trouble because of me." Elena shook her head. "Don't say that, Mom. You are the most important thing to me. I would do anything for you." Victoria watched as Elena cared for her mother, preparing her tea and adjusting her pillows. The devotion and love in Elena's eyes were evident. Suddenly, Victoria felt like an intruder. What was she doing there, spying on her employee? She moved away from the door, feeling a mixture of shame and confusion. As she descended the stairs, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. The poverty in which Elena lived, the sacrifice she made for her mother, the gratitude she felt for a simple act of understanding. Back in her car, Victoria sat there, unable to start the engine. Tears began to fall down her cheeks, taking her by surprise. "What's happening to me?" she asked out loud. Images of her own past began to flood her mind. She remembered the days when she herself struggled to make ends meet, when every penny counted and an understanding boss could make the difference between eating or not. Victoria looked towards the building where Elena lived, suddenly feeling ashamed of her behavior in recent years. How could she have forgotten where she came from? How had she become the type of person she once despised? With trembling hands, she started the car and drove back to her mansion. Throughout the journey, she couldn't stop thinking about Elena and her mother, about the daily struggle they faced, and how she, Victoria, had made that struggle even more difficult with her attitude. Upon arriving home, Victoria went directly to her study. She took out the old photograph she kept, the one where she appeared in her waitress uniform. She looked at it for a long time, remembering the young woman full of dreams and determination she once was. "What would you say if you saw me now?" she murmured to the image of her younger self. That night, Victoria could barely sleep. Her mind kept racing, thinking about Elena, about her own life, about the decisions she had made, and about the consequences of her actions. When she finally managed to fall asleep, her dreams were plagued with images from the past mixed with current reality. The next morning, Victoria woke up with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She quickly dressed and went down to the kitchen, surprising Maria, who was preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Maria," said Victoria, her voice softer than usual. Maria looked at her with surprise. "Good morning, Mrs. Montero. Are you feeling all right?" Victoria nodded. "Yes, thank you. Has Elena arrived yet?" "Yes, ma'am. She's in the garden watering the plants." Victoria headed to the garden, where she found Elena working diligently. The young woman looked up upon hearing her boss's footsteps and visibly tensed. "Good morning, Mrs. Montero," said Elena, putting down the watering can. "Do you need anything?" Victoria looked at her for a moment, noticing the dark circles under her eyes and the way her shoulders slightly hunched from fatigue. "Elena," Victoria began, her voice softer than Elena had ever heard. "How is your mother?" Elena blinked, surprised by the question. She's better. Thank you for asking. The doctors say she'll be able to return home in a few days." Victoria nodded. "I'm glad." "Elena, I want to talk to you about something important. Could you come to my study in an hour?" Elena felt her heart racing. Was she going to fire her? "Of course, Mrs. Montero." Victoria turned to leave but stopped. "And Elena, don't worry. It's nothing bad." As Victoria walked away, Elena stared after her, confused by this sudden change in her boss. The next hour passed slowly for both women. Elena continued with her tasks, her mind racing, wondering what Victoria wanted. For her part, Victoria locked herself in her study, preparing for a conversation she knew would change things. When Elena softly knocked on the study door, Victoria took a deep breath before saying, "Come in." Elena entered, her face a mask of controlled nervousness. "You wanted to see me, Mrs. Montero?" Victoria nodded, pointing to a chair in front of her desk. "Please sit down, Elena." Once Elena was seated, Victoria looked her directly in the eyes. Elena, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you. About your situation, about how I've treated you. Elena opened her mouth to speak, but Victoria raised a hand to stop her. Please let me finish. I've been unfair to you. More than unfair. I've been cruel, insensitive, and I'm ashamed of it. Elena's eyes widened, unable to believe what she was hearing. Victoria continued, her voice trembling slightly. Last night I followed you. You followed me? Asked Elena, surprised. Victoria nodded, ashamed. I know it was inappropriate and an invasion of your privacy. But I saw your apartment, Elena. I saw how you care for your mother, and it made me realize how wrong I've been. Elena was left speechless, watching as her boss's eyes filled with tears. I also come from a humble background, Elena, Victoria continued. I worked as a waitress to pay for my studies. I fought and struggled to get where I am. But somewhere along the way, I forgot where I came from. I became the type of person I once despised. Victoria stood up and walked to the window, turning her back to Elena for a moment. When she turned around, her eyes shone with determination. I want to make things right, Elena. Not just with you, but with all my staff. I want to be the type of boss I would have wanted to have when I was in your position. Elena, still stunned by this revelation, managed to find her voice. Mrs. Montero, I don't know what to say. Victoria sat down again, leaning forward. You don't have to say anything, Elena. I'm the one who should apologize, and I want to do more than that. I want to help you. Help me? Asked Elena, confused. Victoria nodded. Yes. First, I want to increase your salary. Not just a little, but enough so that you don't have to worry about your mother's medicines or having a second job. Elena felt her eyes filling with tears. Mrs. Montero, that's very generous, but I'm not finished, Victoria gently interrupted. I also want to help you with your education. I know you left your studies to take care of your mother. I want you to resume them. I'll pay for your tuition and give you a flexible schedule so you can attend classes. Elena couldn't hold back the tears. I don't know what to say. Why are you doing this? Victoria smiled sadly. Because it's the right thing to do, Elena. And because someone once gave me a chance, and it's time for me to do the same for someone else. She stood up and walked around the desk, sitting in the chair next to Elena. I know I can't erase how I've treated you in the past, but I hope you'll give me the chance to make amends. Elena, overwhelmed with emotion, could only nod. Victoria continued, her voice soft but firm. And I want you to know that this isn't charity. You're an exceptional worker, Elena. You deserve this opportunity, and I know you'll make the most of it. Elena finally found her voice. Thank you, Mrs. Montero. I don't know how to thank you. Victoria shook her head. You don't have to thank me. Just promise me that you won't forget where you come from. That when you reach the top, you'll extend a hand to those who are still struggling. Elena nodded, wiping away her tears. I promise. Victoria smiled, a genuine smile that Elena had never seen before. Good. Now how about we go visit your mother? I'd like to meet her. Elena looked at her, surprised. Really? Victoria nodded. Yes, I think it's time I met the woman who raised such an extraordinary daughter. As they left the study, Victoria felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew she had a long way to go to make amends for her mistakes, not just with Elena, but with all her staff. But for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with herself. And as they walked together towards the car, Victoria realized that she hadn't just changed Elena's life. Elena, without knowing it, had changed hers too. Victoria Montero adjusted the rearview mirror of her luxurious car, observing Elena seated in the back seat. The young employee seemed nervous, fidgeting with the edge of her blouse while looking out the window. Elena, said Victoria, breaking the silence, are you sure your mother won't mind this surprise visit? Elena startled slightly. Oh no, Mrs. Montero. My mother always says she'd love to meet my boss. Although, she hesitated for a moment. I think she'll be a bit surprised. Victoria nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. I imagine you've told her about me, about how I was before. Well, Elena began, but Victoria interrupted her. You don't have to soften things, Elena. I know I was difficult. Elena let out a small laugh. That's a kind way of putting it, ma'am. Victoria couldn't help but smile. I suppose I deserve that. You know, you can call me Victoria when we're not at the mansion. "Oh, I don't think I could do that," Alina replied, blushing. "Try it," Victoria insisted. "Consider it an order if it makes you feel better." Alina took a deep breath. "All right, Victoria?" Both women shared a smile, the atmosphere in the car noticeably more relaxed. When they arrived at the modest apartment building, Victoria felt a mix of emotions. Shame for having judged Elena so harshly without knowing her situation, and determination to make things right. "It's here," said Elena, pointing to the entrance. Victoria parked the car and they both got out. As they climbed the stairs, Victoria noticed the peeling walls and the smell of dampness. Her heart sank thinking of Elena returning to this place every night after a long day of work at the mansion. Upon reaching the apartment, Elena took out her keys, but before opening, she turned to Victoria. "Mrs. Mon, Victoria," she corrected herself. "Before we go in, I want to thank you again for everything you're doing. It means a lot to me and my mother." Victoria put a hand on Elena's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. I'm the one who should apologize for not seeing how extraordinary you are sooner." Elena smiled and opened the door. "Mom, I'm home. And I brought a visitor." Elena's mother, seated in an old armchair by the window, looked up from her book. Her eyes widened upon seeing Victoria. "Mom, this is Mrs. Victoria Montero, my boss," Elena introduced. Victoria stepped forward, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carmen," the woman responded, shaking Victoria's hand with surprise. "Carmen Vega. Excuse me if I seem surprised. It's just that Elena has told me a lot about you, but I never thought you'd come to visit us." Victoria noticed Carmen's tone and couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. "Yes, I imagine not all of it has been good." Carmen looked at her daughter, then back at Victoria. "Well, lately, Elena has said that you've changed a lot." Victoria nodded. "It's true. I've made many mistakes, Mrs. Vega, and I'm here to make amends." Elena interrupted. "Mom, Victoria has been very generous. She's increased my salary and wants to help me finish my studies." Carmen looked at Victoria with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Is that true?" Victoria sat down in a nearby chair, her upright posture contrasting with the worn furniture. "Yes, it's true. You see, Mrs. Vega, your daughter has taught me a valuable lesson about humility and perseverance. I'm ashamed to admit that I forgot my own humble origins and became someone unpleasant." Carmen listened attentively, her expression softening. "Elena has always been special, since she was a child, always thinking of others before herself." "Mom," Elena protested, blushing. Victoria smiled. "She's right. Your daughter is extraordinary, and I want to make sure she has all the opportunities she deserves." Carmen looked at Victoria curiously. "What made you change your mind about my daughter?" Victoria took a deep breath, preparing to confess. "The truth is, I followed you last night." "What?" Elena and Carmen exclaimed in unison. "I know, it was inappropriate and I apologize for it," Victoria quickly continued. "But seeing Elena's devotion, how she cares for you despite all the difficulties, it made me realize how wrong I was." Carmen frowned. "So you spied on us?" "Mom, please," Elena intervened. "Victoria's apologizing." Victoria raised a hand. "No, Elena, your mother is right to be upset. It was an invasion of your privacy and I deeply regret it." There was a moment of tense silence. Finally, Carmen spoke. "You know, Mrs. Montero, when Elena started working for you, I prayed every night for you to be fair to my daughter. I listened to her stories about how tough you were and wondered why someone with so much could be so insensitive to someone who has so little." Victoria lowered her gaze, ashamed. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Vega. I have no excuse for my behavior," Carmen continued, her voice softening a bit. "But I also believe that people can change. And if you're here, admitting your mistakes and wanting to make things right, well, that says a lot about you." Victoria looked up, surprised by the understanding in Carmen's voice. "Thank you, Mrs. Vega. I promise I'll do everything possible to make up for everything Elena has been through." Elena, who had been watching the exchange nervously, finally intervened. "Mom, Victoria doesn't just want to help me. She also wants to help you with your treatments." Carmen looked at Victoria with surprise. "Is that true?" Victoria nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Vega. I want to make sure you receive the best possible medical care, without worrying about the costs." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Victoria replied softly. "Just accept it as an apology for all the stress I've caused your daughter." Elena, emotional, hugged her mother. "See, Mom? I told you things were going to get better. Carmen hugged her daughter but looked at Victoria. Mrs. Montero, I appreciate your generosity, but you must understand that it's a lot to process. Just a few days ago, my daughter was crying about the treatment she received at work. And now, Victoria nodded understandingly. I understand perfectly, Mrs. Vega. I don't expect you to trust me immediately. I just ask for the opportunity to prove that my change is sincere. Elena separated from her mother and looked at Victoria. I trust you, Victoria. You've shown that you really want to change. Victoria felt a warmth in her chest at Elena's words. Thank you, Elena. That means a lot to me. Carmen observed the interaction between her daughter and Victoria, noticing the change in dynamics. Well, Mrs. Montero, it seems my daughter sees something good in you. And Elena has always been a good judge of character. Victoria smiled. Your daughter is very wise, Mrs. Vega. More than I was able to see at first. The atmosphere in the small living room noticeably relaxed. Carmen, although still cautious, seemed more open to Victoria's presence. Would you like some coffee? Carmen offered. It's nothing fancy, but I'd love some, Victoria interrupted with a genuine smile. And I'm sure it will be the best coffee I've had in a long time. While Elena helped her mother in the small kitchen, Victoria observed the apartment with new eyes. She noticed the family photographs on the walls, the small touches that made this place a home, despite its modesty. She realized how much she had judged without knowing, and felt a new determination growing inside her. When Carmen returned with the coffee, Victoria took it gratefully. Mrs. Vega, I'd like, if you'll allow me, to tell you a bit about my own story. I think it's important that you understand where I come from and why the change I'm experiencing is so significant to me. Carmen nodded, curious. I'm listening, Mrs. Montero. Victoria took a sip of coffee and began her story. Many years ago, I was in a situation not very different from Elena's. I worked as a waitress to pay for my studies. My mother was also ill, and I struggled every day to support her and move forward. Elena and Carmen listened attentively, surprised by this revelation. One day, Victoria continued, I met a man, a successful businessman. He saw potential in me and gave me a chance. He offered me a job in his company and helped me finish my studies. Thanks to him, I was able to take better care of my mother and eventually build my own business. Victoria paused, her gaze lost in memories. But somewhere along the way, I forgot where I came from. I became hard, insensitive. I thought being successful meant being ruthless. I was terribly wrong. Carmen nodded understandingly. Success can change people, not always for the better. Victoria continued, her voice filled with emotion. When I saw Elena caring for you, with so much love and dedication despite all the difficulties, it was like seeing myself years ago. And I realized what I had become. Elena, moved by Victoria's confession, placed a hand on her boss's. It's never too late to change, Victoria. Victoria smiled gratefully at her. You're right, Elena. And it's thanks to you that I've had this epiphany. I want to be the kind of person who lends a hand to others, as others once did for me. Carmen, who had been listening attentively, spoke. Mrs. Montero, I appreciate your honesty. It can't be easy to admit one's own mistakes, especially in front of, well, those you've wronged. Victoria nodded. You're right, Mrs. Vega, but it's necessary. I can't change the past, but I can ensure the future is different. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Asked Carmen, still with a touch of skepticism in her voice. Victoria straightened up, her determination evident. Well, to start with, as I mentioned before, I want to make sure Elena can finish her studies. I'll offer her a flexible schedule and cover all expenses related to her education. Elena, although she had heard it before, couldn't help but tear up. Victoria, I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Victoria replied with a smile. You've earned it with your dedication and integrity. Then, turning to Carmen, she continued, as for you, Mrs. Vega, I want to ensure you receive the best possible medical care. I know some of the best specialists in the country, and I'll make sure they attend to you. Carmen seemed overwhelmed for a moment. Mrs. Montero, that's very generous, but Victoria gently interrupted her. Please accept it. Not as charity, but as a way to make amends for my mistakes and do the right thing. There was a moment of silence as Carmen processed everything. Finally, with tears in her eyes, she nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Montero. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Victoria responded. Just promise me that you'll allow me to prove that my change is sincere. Elena, emotional, impulsively hugged Victoria. Thank you, Victoria. This means everything to us. Victoria, surprised by the gesture, took a moment to respond to the hug. When she did, she felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. Thank you, Elena, for opening my eyes. Carmen observed the scene with a mix of emotions. Although still cautious, she couldn't deny the sincerity in Victoria's eyes. Mrs. Montero, it seems my daughter has had a profound impact on you. Victoria gently separated from the hug and looked at Carmen. That's right, Mrs. Vega. Your daughter has taught me more in these few days than many mentors throughout my career. Well, said Carmen with a small smile, I always knew my Elena was special. Elena blushed. Mom, please. Victoria chuckled softly. Your mother is right, Elena. You are truly extraordinary. The atmosphere in the small living room had completely transformed. The initial tension had given way to a warmth and mutual understanding that none of the three women would have imagined possible just a few hours ago. Victoria looked at her watch and was surprised to see how much time had passed. Oh my, I didn't realize the time. I don't want to abuse your hospitality, Mrs. Vega. Carmen shook her head. Don't worry, Mrs. Montero. It's been revealing to have you here. Victoria stood up. Thank you for receiving me and for listening. I promise you'll see concrete actions very soon. As they headed to the door, Elena spoke. Victoria, can I ask you something? Of course, Elena. What will happen at work? I mean, with the other employees. Victoria immediately understood Elena's concern. Don't worry. The changes won't be just for you. I plan to review the working conditions of all the staff. There will be raises, better benefits, and a more positive work environment for everyone. Carmen, who had followed them to the door, intervened. That sounds like a big change, Mrs. Montero. Are you sure you're prepared for it? Victoria nodded with determination. More than sure, Mrs. Vega. It's time for my company to reflect the values I should have maintained from the beginning. Before leaving, Victoria turned one last time to Carmen. Mrs. Vega, I know you have reasons to distrust me, but I promise I'll do everything in my power to show you that my change is genuine. Carmen looked her in the eyes for a long moment before responding. I'll judge you by your actions, Mrs. Montero. But I must admit that today, I've seen a side of you that gives me hope. Victoria smiled gratefully. That's all I ask. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. With a final hug to Elena and a handshake to Carmen, Victoria left the apartment. As she descended the stairs, she felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt at peace with herself. Upon reaching her car, Victoria paused for a moment, looking up at the window of the Vegas apartment. She saw Elena and Carmen watching her from above. She gave them a smile and a small wave before getting into the vehicle. As she drove back to her mansion, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing her company's culture, earning her employees' trust, and maintaining her new approach would require constant effort and dedication. But for the first time in a long time, Victoria felt excited about the future. She had rediscovered a part of herself she thought was lost, and she was determined not to lose it again. Upon arriving at her mansion, Victoria didn't head directly to her room as she usually did. Instead, she went to the kitchen, where she found Maria preparing dinner. Maria, she called softly. The housekeeper turned, surprised to see Victoria in the kitchen at that hour. Yes, Mrs. Montero. Victoria took a deep breath. Maria, I want to thank you for all these years of loyal service, and I want to apologize for not being the boss you deserved. Maria looked at her open mouth, clearly confused by this sudden change. Ma'am, please let me finish, Victoria continued. Starting tomorrow, there will be changes in this house, positive changes for you and all the staff. I want you to know that I value your work and that of everyone else, and I promise to be better from now on. Maria, with tears in her eyes, could only nod. Thank you, Mrs. Montero. That means a lot to all of us. Victoria smiled, feeling lighter than ever. No, Maria, thank you for your patience. And please, when there are no guests, call me Victoria. As she left the kitchen, leaving a stunned but happy Maria behind, Victoria thought of Elena and how a simple employee had achieved what years of therapy and self-help hadn't, restoring her humanity. That night before going to sleep, Victoria looked once more at the old photograph of herself as a waitress. But this time, instead of hiding it, she placed it in a prominent spot on her nightstand. "I will never forget where I come from again," she murmured to herself before turning off the light, ready to face a new day and a new chapter in her life.